presumption today. So we'll go over in general what is presumption, because it is a more procedural argument. And then we'll dive into like how we can make presumption a winning argument when you are on the negative. Okay. Wait like one more minute. I think this might be everyone too, so let me make sure I have everything pulled up correctly. Okay. Let me share my screen with you all. Okay, is everyone thumbs up able to see the screen? I got one from Lily. Okay, great. I was just like, just some confirmation so I know it's working properly. But yeah, we're gonna go over, like I just mentioned, critical presumption today. So hopefully at the end of this lecture, right, we'll be able to all address first, what is presumption in terms of a procedural argument? How does it operate? Why do we have this type of rule in debate anyways? Then we'll talk about how can we use presumption as an argument. Then we'll get into the crux of this conversation, and we're going to talk about how to use presumption when you're going against a KAF in ways that you can make it like a winning argument, like we had mentioned. But we'll also address, can presumption ever flow on the affirmative side? And that will make sense later. So if you're AF, can you ever use presumption against the negative? And we can also talk about, you know, how can we, if you're doing a K debate on the neg, use that K to make presumption arguments against a policy affirmative. All righty, so one like disclaimer, I'm going to try to make this a little bit interactive, so there will be times where I'll ask you all some questions, and since we only have an hour, if you know we're not like getting too many responses, I hate to be that person, but I'll happily like call on people as well, just so that way we can have like some paraphrasing feedback, just to make sure that we're all engaged in digesting the conversation. But to begin, what is presumption? So presumption is this procedural argument that's kind of one of the foundational rules for debate that makes it possible for us to even have a debate in the first place. So on both sides, there are two different burdens like each side has, or one burden that each side has. So the affirmative holds the burden of proof. The negative holds the burden of refutation. So what that means is that the burden of proof that the AF has is that the affirmative has to highlight a problem within the status quo, and then they have to create a plan that's going to solve that problem. And they also have to show how that plan's going to work, right? So that's similar to just how, like, why we have your inherency, your harms, your plan, and then your solvency. All of those portions are what makes up this burden of proof, or shapes the burden of proof that the AF has. So for this topic, for example, right, when we're looking at our policy affirmative, we're saying right now there's this loophole in fracking that allows for the impacts of environmental pollution and poor drinking water. So we're going to use this policy to fix that loophole, and that's going to make it so we no longer have like poor fracking regulations that makes it so we have this horrible pollution happening, right? So the affirmative has this burden to prove that there's this harm with fracking that's happening, and that the uniqueness or inherency is actually the reality of the situation, right? So if the affirmative got up and read a plan, but let's say a bill or law passed a week ago that completely changed the plan, right? Then we could argue, hey, this is not unique. That already happened. That's no longer the status quo of the situation. So it makes it so, like, what are we debating about, right? So that's why the affirmative has to prove that the reality of the situation is what the affirmative is saying, that there's specific harms based on the reality of the situation, and that they can use a plan to solve the reality of that situation. Next, we have the negatives burden. So for the negative, we have to prove that something is wrong with the affirmative or that the status quo is fine. So either the affirmative does something to make things worse, or we should just leave things as is because there's actually not a problem. So that being said, we can read things such as like counter plans or alternatives, but when we're going for presumption, it's more so just a question of did the AF meet their burden, not can we provide an alternative world in which things would be better than what the AF is doing. Now, presumption is what we use to like hold either side to their burden. So typically presumption errs negative, which means that the presumption argument is an argument that the negative will make against the affirmative to say, hey, you came into the debate without having an AF that fully meets your burden of proof. At times, the affirmative can say, hey, you can vote AF on presumption because the negative failed to show something that was wrong with the AF, such as if you read an argument, if you're reading like a K, for example, and you only go for a link that is about like omission, right? And an omission link is basically saying you didn't talk about, let's say we're talking about capitalism, right? You didn't talk about capitalism, so you should lose. That link of omission doesn't mean the AF actually did something wrong. It's more so saying that you didn't say something and that wasn't good. But it's not actually like the plan, like targeting the plan or policy or solvency that the affirmative has. So in those unique situations, the affirmative can say the negative did not meet their burden, so you can vote AF on presumption. But again, those cases aren't as common, which is why we typically think of presumption as a negative argument. Now, if the AF doesn't meet their burden of proof, then the ballot goes to the negative. So you can think of presumption similar to how we think of topicality, right? It's like this it's not always an off-case argument, but it's this argument that is about the procedural rules in which the teams have to follow. And it's saying, hey, no matter what, no matter like what the dissat is, the counter plan is, the K is, since you didn't meet this burden, this rule, this like foundational law of debate, then you automatically lose. Similar to T, where it's like, hey, even if your plan is good, you can win 100% like solvency of your plan or whatever, you still didn't fall like within the resolution, therefore you should lose. So far, does our like understanding of presumption or what presumption is, does that make sense to everyone so far? Okay, if there's any questions at any point in time, feel free to just like unmute yourself and jump in. It does get a little hard to like watch the chat at times, so feel free to just like interrupt me, no issue at all, and be like, hey, I have this question. Okay. So now that we kind of went over like what is presumption, we are going to now talk about like how can we use presumption as an argument. And this is more just general guidelines, so it can work against a policy AF or KAF, and then we'll get into specifically when you're doing like K debates, how to use presumption. But first, there are different points in the AF that we can target when we're going for presumption. So you can target the inherency, the harms, the plan / solvency. And at times like solvency can kind of correlate to the harms as well. But real quick, before we like kind of describe how we can target these things, I'm gonna ask the question of, does anyone have a idea or possible option to use presumption to target either inherency, harms, or solvency when you are negative going against an AF? All right, Vincent, I'm going to call on you. Do you have an idea of what might be a way to use presumption based on it being the argument that you have to meet this burden of proof to target either the inherency, harms, or solvency of an affirmative?
Yeah, so like if you can prove that like an AF doesn't solve for like the problems they listed in the status quo, you can say that the aff doesn't actually do anything, and you can vote neg on presumption.
Yes, exactly. Okay, and then Lillian, do you have another way that we might possibly able to use presumption as an argument outside of the aff didn't solve for the harms they're talking about?
Maybe it could be, I might be wrong on this, but maybe it could be something like their impacts won't happen. So I guess like the affirmative doesn't really do anything. It doesn't solve for anything. So therefore, like just vote neg on presumption.
Yes, exactly. Like y'all got it in the bag. That is exactly how we would use presumption to target harms or solvency. Solvency is the aff doesn't actually fix the harms they outlined. And then the harms would be these impacts actually won't ever happen in the status quo. And then for inherency, that was kind of the example we were talking about earlier, where let's say our affirmative right is about fracking and changing the specific policy. And then let's say in this, like the actual reality of the situation, the status quo, the government passed that very same policy like a month prior. The inherency is no longer unique. So the aff didn't prove that there's something wrong that we need to fix. So that's where we get this phrase that people typically associate with presumption of if it ain't broken, don't fix it. Right? You have to prove that there's something wrong. If you don't prove there's something wrong or something that needs to be fixed, then the aff didn't meet their burden. So you vote negative on presumption. Now, presumption arguments, right? These can look like case turns. They can look like links. They can look like solvency takeouts, and they can look like disadds. So when we're thinking of like case turns, for example, that could be like turning the harms or turning the inherency, such as like this isn't actually the reality of the situation. When you're going for links, such as links to a disadd or links to a K, you can also go for those arguments as presumption arguments, depending on what the link specifically is. So for example, if you are going against the cap K and you're doing a root cause link and you're saying like capitalism, right, is a root cause of all of this like environmental pollution, such as why we have fracking in the first place, then you could say that the affirmative will actually never solve their case because this root cause link means that they won't actually get to solve for their harms, right? So then you can say that all of these links, or specifically this root cause link, works as a reason to vote negative on presumption because the affirmative does not solve their impacts based on capitalism, like overcoding the reason that we have these harms. You can also do solvency takeouts. So that's exactly what Vincent had mentioned when he was like, hey, you don't solve for the specific harms. So those are solvency takeouts that can also mean you vote negative on presumption. And then shockingly enough, like even disadds, right? Because when you think about in terms of like procedural or rule wise, like the bare basics of what is a disadd, the disadd is not providing a counter plan. It's not providing an alternative, right? It's just saying that the status quo is better than the world of the affirmative. So that means that aff does something that makes things worse, and you should vote for keeping things how they are now. So presumption and the status quo, or ways that things currently operate, like go hand in hand. They kind of like two sides to a similar coin. Because basically, if you're voting on presumption, you're voting to leave things as is because the aff doesn't prove that they create a better world. So disadds as well, or links to disadds, can be used to vote negative or make that presumption argument. Now, we've mentioned it a couple times that presumption does not involve an alt or a counter plan. That does not mean that you can't read a counter plan, but then go for presumption on case. They're not mutually exclusive, right? It's just a question. Whereas, when you think of topicality, you're typically like, if I'm going for T, I'm going in on it for the last 5 minutes hard. Presumption can be a case argument, and you can still have a counter plan. You can still engage in the debate, but it's more so a question of, does the case actually solve? Does the case prove that there's something wrong? But if you're like having a lot of case turns or like solvency takeouts or links, such as like links to Ks or disadds, a lot of arguments that shape this presumption argument, then sometimes you do want to spend your entire 5 minutes proving why the world of the AF like is either not the reality or doesn't solve their plan. But that's not to say that going for presumption is mutually exclusive with the counter plan or reading a K. And also, if you choose to read a critique, you can always later, in times, like careful to make sure you cover all of your defense or any like offense that the other team puts on that flow. But you can at times kick out of the alternative and just go for those links as disadds to the AF to then make that presumption argument as well. So that's just like the foundational ways in which we can use presumption against any type of affirmative. We kind of structured it more so against a policy AF, but so far, can I have a thumbs up like if that helps make sense or clarify how we can use presumption just 101? Awesome. Okay, great. So moving on. I know I have it on the screen right now, but quick, like not look at the bullet points and read it. Would someone be able to tell me, based on your experiences, what are some things that you notice are different between a policy AF and a KAF?
I can take this. A KAF typically is critiquing the resolution or how the debate space operates. And they usually focus on structural issues. Like I've run KAFs my past 2 years debating. So KAFs typically just see something wrong with the world and they don't necessarily use like a specific plan, but usually it's like an advocacy statement or like affirming something versus making a plan.
Yes, like exactly. I think you literally hit every point that I had on there. So thank you for that. That was like right on point. So just like we had talked about, policy AF is going to be something that accepts the resolution on face value. It can have existential impacts, not to say that KAFs don't, and not to say that these are set in stone rules, but it's just typically some main differences that you notice. And the policy AF is going to have a plan text. Now, a KAF is going to have worldview / epistemology questions. So we're going to question the resolution. We're going to question how we know what we know. We're going to question just traditional assumptions that we have when we go into making policies. A KAF is not going to take the resolution on face value. It's going to use those that worldview or epistemology to critique the resolution. So again, great point for like saying critiquing the resolution. That is exactly what typically happens in a KAF. And then it's traditionally not focused on existential risks or crises. So it's not to say that a KAF can't say that this will cause like nuclear war, or in terms of climate change, a KAF might say that this is going to be the brink that pushes us like into the Anthropocene versus giving us an opportunity to like save the environment from like a complete environmental collapse. But traditionally it's more structural issues. And then there's also an advocacy statement versus a plan text. And that's not to say every single time that a KAF won't read a plan text. Sometimes it could be a plan text that's like a very radical, very imaginative type of plan text, such as the United States federal government should give the land back. When we think of like settler colonialism, that still is a plan text, right? But in terms of traditional policy, it's not going to be a bill that we see on the congressional floor, probably ever, right? In terms of how we think of American policy. Or there could be an advocacy statement, such as we affirm poetry or we affirm music to solve or do X, Y, and Z or create some type of survival mechanism. So KAFs, again, are a little bit different than policy AFs, and that big difference comes with like this worldview epistemology question. So the burden of proof then in KAFs, they're going to be a little bit different than how we see them in policy AFs. So in the K affirmative, right, their worldview is going to explain their harms, and their advocacy statement is going to create some type of change. So their burden is to prove that, one, their worldview is the reality. So when you have like a K on K debate, right, y'all are typically debating about what is the actual reality of the situation, what power, like what is the ways that power operates, how does power shape the harms or the current resolution, right? So the AF has to prove that their worldview is correct, their epistemology is correct. Then they need to prove that there are some unique harms that are happening. So when we say like unique harms, right, we're saying we have ongoing forms of like structural violence, but they need to show that they have a way to like target those forms of violence or help solve or mitigate or produce some type of survival mechanism, however they choose to articulate their advocacy. They need to show that there's some like unique way that they're able to challenge a like actual form of violence, because unfortunately, like at the end of the day, we are not going to be able to just like snap our fingers and solve for anti-Blackness or snap our fingers and solve for like class structural issues, right? So we have to show that, hey, there's like this specific type of violence that's happening in terms of our topic. It might be environmental racism. It might be like dumping zones in Black and brown areas. It might be water pollution, such as we see in Flint, or we see in different cities that are predominantly Black, brown, and impoverished areas. So if we are talking about like those harms specifically, you then have to show that your advocacy statement makes some type of change, right? And again, that could be a survival skill. That could be something like a way to just like navigate or support yourself or engage in happiness. It depends on how the affirmative chooses to articulate their advocacy statement. It could also be a disruption, and it says like, hey, this is a way that we can disrupt anti-Black structures, or this is a way that we can disrupt like settler colonialist structures. So depending, again, how their advocacy statement operates or what the affirmative is saying we should do, it needs to be able to attack their harms or solve in the way that they are claiming it solves for. So we can look at our critical AF. Now, this is where I'll ask another question. Based on our critical AF, what would you all say is the worldview? What would you all say is the harms? And what would you say the AF does to solve them? Okay, can we raise our hands to see who has looked at the critical AF at all yet? Because that might be a better way. If none of us have looked at it, that's important. Okay. Okay. So Luke or Zoe, either one of you, if you would like to talk about the worldview, harms, and how the AF solves, that would be thebomb.com. That was such an old phrase. Please don't judge me.
I'm not judging you for that. I can try. So I think from what I understand of the KAF in the like camp files is that it's basically saying that like how we view water is something that doesn't take into account what water has meant to Black people. And so because of that view we have of water, we are continuing to like, and how it's been denied from Black people, and it's culminated in things like Flint, Michigan crisis and things like that. And that's the harms. And then this AF, I know it's like the advocacy statement was something of like a movement or something about reframing how we think about water in terms of Black people in this country and in terms of like the allocation of water.
Yes, exactly. So our affirmative, right, when you were saying the like advocacy statement, it's more of an epistemology question, right? And it's more of an orientation or shift or view of how we think about policy, how we think about water, how we think about like communities that are suffering from lack of these resources. So the way that that will solve, right, for our harms is it's like a prior step. We have to first like reorient ourselves to use like a lens that like recognizes anti-Blackness to then address the ways that like water resources and water policy has like this negative impact and antagonistic relationship with the Black community, specifically due to the legacy of slavery and the ways that like the Black community and Indigenous community has a very different relationship to water. So that's how like our critical aff is saying we have like a worldview. Worldview is like anti-Blackness is that structural antagonism we're talking about. Harms, water has a different relationship to Black people than we think about it in terms of the resolution. And that looks like or manifests in ways such as the Flint water crisis. Solve, we need to critically like reorient our understanding and affirm like this Black Lives Matter type politics to allow us to change the way that we view water policy, and then that will allow us to affirm these communities, right? So awesome, thank you again for like answering and like on point. So next we're going to talk about like how do we then use critical presumption to target a K affirmative, such as the K aff that we have in our camp file. So similar to the traditional aff, the neg can go for presumption by targeting the solvency and the advocacy statements. But the one thing that's a little bit different is we also can target the worldview. So in terms of solvency and advocacy statements, we can say, does the advocacy statement actually solve the harms, or at least does it do what it claims to do? And it's also a question of uniqueness, right? Is this advocacy statement or solvency statement like unique? So when we think of like the advocacy statement, right? If somebody's saying, I affirm hip hop, you can argue, hey, hip hop has been around for like several decades. It started off as like this grassroots type communicative style, so that way people could resist those very structures you're talking about. So why in this debate is it important to continue that affirmation of hip hop that with or without your affirmative, it will continue to happen? So what's the uniqueness? So if the advocacy statement or the solvency like is not unique, then you can argue to vote on presumption because the aff doesn't do anything new. And that's that key statement that I had just said of with or without this affirmative, it will continue to happen. Outside of this debate room, it's already happening. So if we think of in terms of our KAF, right? Where we're saying you need to like have this radical reorientation, then you can argue, hey, what's unique about just having this like epistemology question? What's unique about having this new lens to look at these structures of issues? Because we already have protests happening in the status quo that revolve around like Black Lives Matter movements or supporting the Black community. We already have people such as Little Miss Flint, who is out here like protesting and calling for us to question the ways that like water resources interact with like Black communities. And we already have tons of like K affirmatives that are just telling us to reorient ourselves and to use like this anti-Blackness lens to understand how policy operates. So what are you doing that is specifically unique? And if they can't prove that the aff is like critical or a brink for some reason, then you vote negative on presumption. For solvency, right? How can we prove that just orienting ourselves in the way that the KAF tells us to will solve for any of these harms? Does that mean that now that we have this lens, are we going to go out and start donating money in water bottles or get groups together to like repipe the pipes that are like full of this like lead poisoning in Flint? Are we going to then like become lobbyists and go out and challenge the government? Are we going to consistently like disrupt conversations in science classes about what water means? We're just going to like stand up and say, actually, you need to think about water in a different way. What is going to happen if we take this lens that the KAF is telling us to take? Like, where's the solvency? What does that do? And if you can prove all that does is have a conversation, it doesn't create any way to solve the harms, then you vote negative on presumption. And last but not least, when we talk about worldview. We can do things like root cause questions or alternative framing of power structure questions. So this can look like the K-AF against a Baudrillard K. And if you win the worldview for Baudrillard, then you can say, hey, the affirmative will actually never solve their impacts. So at the very minimum, if I don't win the alternative, I still won the epistemology question, which means you vote negative on presumption because the AF can never solve, right? Or if you're thinking of a different way, if you're reading kind of like a states like dissat, or if you're making states like state good arguments on case, then you can say I won that it's possible to have like political change within the government, or to have contingent moments of reform that are beneficial for these communities that you're talking about suffering. And because of this, like the affirmative is never going to solve for their harms because they create like this nihilistic view of how policy operates, which means we basically will cede the political and continue to allow these forms of violence. So you should vote negative on presumption because I showed their understanding of the USFG is incorrect, which means they actually don't solve for any of their harms, or the entirety, the foundations of their case don't like piece together. So if you think of presumption, right, you have like this entire puzzle that's going to shape up your affirmative. All of your pieces like go together in this like linear way. If you remove one piece, then the worldview doesn't connect to the advocacy statement. So like if you take away the solvency, your worldview and advocacy statement don't get to work together because you no longer are solving, right? If you take away the advocacy statement, you have the worldview and the solvency, but how do you get to that solvency? Or if you take away the worldview, right, then you have this advocacy statement and solvency, but the way that you understand your harms are actually incorrect. So there's no reason to use that type of advocacy statement to have that type of solvency. So presumption is basically saying, if I take away one of those puzzle pieces, you can't vote AF because they did not meet their burden of proof. So far, thumbs up. Does that make sense in terms of like foundations of K, like reading presumption against the KAF? Are there any questions at this moment? Yeah, go ahead, Luke.
I had a question about the very last bullet. The conceding the worldview can be used as a strategic advantage. Can you?
I'm so sorry, Luke. For some reason, it's really, really quiet. Are you able to talk just a little bit louder for me?
Yeah. Can you hear me fine? Hello? Is it still quiet?
Let me see. I'm gonna turn my volume all the way up. Okay, it should be good.
Can you hear me? Yeah, so I had a question about the very last point. The conceding the worldview can be used as a strategic advantage. Could you explain this last part?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I was still like just finishing the advocacy statement portion, so I'll jump into that section next. So presumption as a winning argument. And when I say this, y'all, like honestly, using presumption, knowing how to use presumption is really going to help you engage with the AF a lot more and have way more like clash-based arguments. So right now in debate, you all might have noticed there's kind of this switch of framework where judges are holding teams when they go for framework to a little bit more of a burden than just role playing good. There has to be a little bit more engagement with the AF, a little bit more conversation about the status quo, and a little bit more conversation about how your framework can still allow for changes in debate to happen that need to happen. So when you go for presumption, it will allow you to like really engage with the affirmative and not just rely on a more traditional like framework or topicality argument. That's not to say that those arguments or debates still aren't good to have or to know, but this is a great resource to have, especially because in K debates, experiences and truth claims hold a lot more weight than just policy on policy. I'm sure you've all had experience where in policy, like your cards can be like very short. They can be like right to the point. They may even only have like 10 words highlighted. And you could read easily 20 cards within a 2AC or 2NC. Now, in like K on K debates, it's often questions of like empiric examples, or like questions of when has these things happened before? What does this look like in the material way? What experiences that I personally know or can relate to can help me convey my argument or conversation? So it's not to say like don't have evidence. You still want to try to have as much evidence as you can, but you can ask those like upfront material questions to create that type of like presumption argument. For example, if you are talking about our KAF, you could ask the question of, so do you think that the parents in Flint right now are going to say, hey, your like critical orientation towards the resolution is good enough to not create a policy to go and fix like the lead poisoning issue that's happening right now? Because in reality, right, like that doesn't have to be like a card to make that argument. That doesn't have to be a survey to make that argument, because there's a truth claim to that, where, you know, I'm sure parents are probably still going to want clean water for their children. Now, that's still a debate to be had if that outweighs the like harms or impacts of the KF, but those are ways that you can like make that case like at times policy or state's good argument without always having to just rely on the evidence of ontology. So next, experiences and truth claims hold heavy weight. That's kind of what I just talked about. Point 3, links, uniqueness, and solvency takeouts are all disadds to the app, reasons to vote on presumption. We kind of mentioned that a little bit earlier when we were talking about like going for Ks or DAs and how there's specific links or harms that the affirmative causes. And you can then use those links, or if you end up like if you feel like you're not winning the alternative debate, right? If you're saying your alt is some type of like burn it down alternative, or if your alternative is something that's related to like the Baudrillard, like a Baudrillard K, right? And you know that you're not winning the alternative to solve the harms, but the app itself doesn't solve the harms because you at least won some links, then you can kick out of your alternative specifically, or you can say, I'm not going for the DA, but you can now flow the links on case as all independent disadds to the affirmative, which are reasons why the AF doesn't solve. So on the disad, you can at least vote negative on presumption. So next, we have that point 4 that Luke, you had mentioned, right? Conceding worldview can be used as a strategic advantage. So when you are debating against a KAF and you're like, hey, you know, I really kind of agree that it can be like anti-Blackness is like this antagonistic relationship, such as how our KAF structures it. And you're like, you know, I really agree with that argument. Like in my, like just personally, like in my heart, I think that's true. And I don't want to argue that anti-Blackness like isn't a structural thing or isn't a structural power relationship. I don't want to just rely and say like, oh, I'm going for the cap K and capitalism is the root cause of anti-Blackness. You can concede that ontology is true. You can concede that anti-Blackness like is the structural antagonism that the affirmative says. You can concede the worldview, but then target the solvency and use that to help propel your argument of like, okay, so if anti-Blackness really is so encompassing, if anti-Blackness is always going to have co-option of identity, if anti-Blackness is always going to exist in the structural antagonism, how does the affirmative solve for anything if you don't completely disrupt or destroy the like way that modernity currently is? Such as burning down the government, such as like having this massive revolution. If you don't do something that like physically, complete and totally breaks apart the way that the world works, then how do you solve for any of your harms? Because if I concede that anti-Blackness is as structurally harmful as it is, then nothing will ever change. And your affirmative of just having this orientation assumes that one, all individuals can create that orientation or create that shift, which takes away or contradicts the arguments or the foundations of anti-Blackness, that it's impossible for like us to ever have that full radical shift without completely like starting or restarting the entirety of America. Luke, does that kind of make a little bit more sense of like using their worldview to kind of propel your you then don't solve arguments, because your worldview is so like over structuring, over damaging, that it completely overpowers your harms or completely overpowers your solvency? So you can vote negative on presumption?
Yeah, it does.
Okay, awesome. Do you have any other questions on that part right there? Or does anyone have any questions? If not, you can just like thumbs up. Okay, I'm gonna assume that we're all a-okay then. Yes, so definitely like conceding worldviews, you don't always have to argue against their epistemology, and especially if you're doing something like anti-Blackness, you can look into like reading certain warrants from like Wilderson or Hartman that definitely like talk about how over like compassing and over structuring this entire like this antagonistic relationship is, specifically against our type of K affirmative, to then almost like out Afro pessimism them ish, or against like different affirmative is if it's capitalism, and again it's just like the AF says, oh, we just do this like epistemology question, orientation question, and it's not something that's like physically material, then you can also make that argument there too of like, hey, your worldview, I concede, I agree with it, but because it's so like damning, there's no way that your advocacy statement can solve for your harm, so you can vote negative on presumption. You can also then couple that with a K or a counter plan, and you could read like a K counter plan, right? And say like, which is similar to an alternative, but you're just like, hey, instead, since the AF isn't able to solve, we should do this instead. And it kind of sounds like it functions as a pick a little bit. But whichever way you choose to like go about it, whether it's a pick, a counter plan, or a K, you can then use that we concede their worldview to say they don't solve, which is why we should do this instead. Or you at least vote negative on presumption. Okay, so that's kind of like the main focus that we wanted to address, was how to use the negative to go for presumption on a KAF. But real quick, we will also address like the question of can we ever go for presumption on the affirmative? So right, we said that the negative has this burden of refutation. So that means that they must prove something is wrong with the affirmative, or there's a better way to do things to avoid some like nonlinear or linear type of impact. So an example is if you are reading right now our policy app, and then you go for the econ DA, right? You're saying, hey, you're going to do something that's going to create like this nonlinear impact, because some of these markets are so intertwined with each other, they like rely on each other, they overlap on each other. So if you make a change over here, it's going to force a change to happen over here, which is going to create all these external type of impacts, which outweigh the impacts of the AF. So at that point, you are debating that the AF does something that even if they may solve in some way a portion of their harms, they create so many other impacts that doing the AF is worse than leaving the status quo as it is. So if the negative does not, make those arguments, if the negative does not prove that the affirmative does something wrong, then the AF can say like, hey, you can vote affirmative on presumption because the AF never showed that the case was done, like that the case did something wrong or that the plan fails, right? So you can think about it in terms of if a team goes for topicality and they spend the last 2 on R, they go 5 minutes hard on T, the first thing that you always want to do, right, is go to case in your 2AR and say they conceded the entirety of case, so that means we gain 100% solvency, right? Which means that since they didn't talk about case, if you win T, then the judge will vote AF on presumption because the negative did not do anything to take out the case plan. You can also go for solvency turns and uniqueness claims if you want to get like you can vote F on presumption argument. An example, if a team reads the cap K against the critical affirmative, right? You are going to have like debates about the root cause of the harms that you're talking about. The affirmative is saying it's anti-Blackness, the negative is saying that it's capitalism. So when you're going back and forth and having this debate, if you're saying on F, you can make that argument, hey, if we win that anti-Blackness is the root cause of our harms, that means that even if they win the alternative debate, even if the negative wins the permutation debate, they don't win that they solve the harms of the 1AC. So you can vote for the F on presumption because our job is to like solve our case. Our job was to prove there was a problem and to show that we can make some impact against it. And we do that. So no matter what else happens on the rest of the flow, you vote F on presumption. You can also do it with uniqueness arguments. If a team reads a K against you and they're going for the cap K and they make an argument or an alternative that you feel like doesn't solve their harms, then you can say the AF had the job to not only prove that the AF did something wrong, but since they're choosing to go for this alternative and they carried that through the entirety of the debate, they have to prove that their alt does something to solve not only their impacts, but the impacts of the AF, because that's one of the most important things when you do a CP or an alternative is that you don't want to just focus on solving your own impacts, but you have the burden to solve the impacts that the AF outlines. So if you're going for an alt and it doesn't solve for the affirmative, then you can say, hey, you should vote F on presumption because they don't actually solve what they say that they're solving for. And also how we did like these uniqueness questions as well. You can make those same uniqueness questions on the F side, where if they're doing an alternative that you feel is non-unique and they're saying, hey, we should just like challenge capitalism or you should like embrace the Communist Party. Then you could say, well, kind of like in the status quo, it's become like a trendy thing to be like a communist or to say you affirm communism. Like all on Twitter, social media feed, you'll find people talking about how they're a part of like the Communist Party. It's non-unique. So your alternative doesn't do anything, again, to solve the harms, because with or without your alt, that's already happening. So one, it's easy to vote on the perm because this is going to happen outside of the debate and the AF can still do what the AF is doing. And two, you can vote on presumption because their argument is non-unique. It's nothing new, right? No new like harm or way to solve that harm is being presented by the negative. So again, typically presumption is a neg argument, but there are ways that the AF can make presumption if the negative does not like fulfill their burden. Does that make sense in terms of using presumption on the AF? Yes. Awesome. Great. So we have an activity that I'm not going to like require, it's not a required thing to do or something that you all have to do today, but if you are interested in like perfecting how to use presumption as an argument, then you can go ahead and like try this activity, sign up for office hours. You can sign up for office hours with me. I'm available like every day for the rest of camp from 3 to 5, or you can sign up with somebody else and just say, hey, I wanted to do this specific activity from the critical presumption argument. So take a SPAR debate flow, like one of the debates that you had earlier, or if you had a like partner debate, take one of those flows as well and rearrange the entirety of your debate. Like use these same arguments that you went like for before against that AF, it was the policy AF or the critical AF. Use the same arguments you went like for before. If you went for topicality or something, then switch it out and like add the K in there or just do case arguments alone, but rearrange the debate so you're only going for presumption. So that's not to say that it's like going to make it so, you know, it should be the entirety of the debate, or in the future you don't want to like go for alternatives or other arguments, but this is just to help you like articulate like case takeouts, like solvency deficits, links as like DAs to the affirmative, but rearrange the debate so you're only going for presumption. You can either do it as a 2NC speech, or you can do it as a 2NR speech. The 2NR might be a little bit easier because that's typically where you're going to see like presumption start to come out. And you can even practice it of saying like, hey, we're not going for the alternative, but we're using all the like the links as disads to the aff. And practice like that framing, that structuring of then cross-applying or extrapolating arguments from different flows to the case flow as disads. So then you can go for, right, presumption as like your winning argument. So find all the possible arguments from that debate and make a speech out of it. And like I said, practice it either on your own or during office hours. And I'm more than happy to, like, if you record yourself and want to send it to me, or if you want to sign up for office hours, whichever way you feel would be helpful, like, I'm more than available to help. But that's for y'all if you want to practice like really going for a presumption, because it can get a little tricky to make sure that you like cross apply arguments and you articulate it strong enough that the judge is seeing that the aff did not fulfill their burden of proof. Because again, without the burden of proof or the burden of refutation, then there's no debate. If the aff comes in and doesn't provide a policy, or the negatives comes in and doesn't like refute that policy, then it's impossible for us to even have a debate in the first place, just like with topicality. So that being said, that kind of brings us to the end of our critical presumption like 101 lecture. How do you all feel? Are there any questions, thoughts, comments, concerns that you all have? Okay, so I'm gonna take again that like silence as everyone is in the process of digesting all of that. But yeah, you can feel free to like message me in the chat. You can put it in your research chat, whatever. If you ever have any thoughts or concerns or ideas you want to bounce back and forth, just let me know and I'm more than available. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you all so much for coming to this lecture.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Thank you so much, Skylar. I appreciate it. You as well.